Well, may I say again how good it is to see you this morning. Thankful for your invitation to come and be a part of your services this morning and to study the scriptures with you. It is it's truly an amazing thing to me how many people the Lord has in this world in various parts of the globe, and how different we may be from brothers and sisters and maybe on the other side of the world, but we're all the Lord's people. And on this day we partake of the Lord's Supper, and we're reminded of how much we have in common, no matter what superficial differences they may be. The greater thing that we have in common is the Lord, and it's always a reminder to me when I go to other places and have the opportunity to worship with people that I don't see very often, that we all are parts of a great big family that goes all the way around the world. Glad that on this Sunday I'm able to be here in Columbus, Indiana, and worship with you. We talked in the Bible study period about some things relating to the Lord's work that we are all part of in one way or another. And we're trying in these lessons to emphasize the choice that we must make to have a mind to work. That phrase comes from Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6, when in their case they were trying to get the wall of Jerusalem repaired that had been broken down when the Babylonians had taken the city some years before that. And Nehemiah was leading them in the work that they had to do at that time. And he said that the work went very well because they had a mind to work. It is a fact, isn't it, that when there's something that needs to be done, it makes a big difference whether we do that with a mind to work or not. We can make almost anything unpleasant unless we choose to do it with a grateful attitude, with a remembrance that what we're doing matters, it's important and all of that. But without having a mind to work, I think it's inevitable that at some point we're just going to get so discouraged that we'd be in danger of just ceasing to work. And so the attitude that we ought to have, not only is the one that would most greatly glorify the Lord, but it will make our part in the work much easier. There are going to be discouragements. The devil will make sure that the path is not always a smooth path. And so the question is not whether there are going to be discouragements, but how we're going to choose to think about those discouragements. As in many other activities in life, we have the option to choose to think about it in a helpful way or an unhelpful way. And so it's I think a thing that we all know if we've lived very long in this world, what it's like to look back to something we should have been doing, or maybe we did it, but we didn't do very well at it, and to realize what a difference it could have made if we had chosen to have a different attitude about what we were doing. So that's what we're trying to emphasize in these lessons. And I want you to look at a statement that's made in Hebrews chapter 12, starting at verse 12. This is toward the end of the book when he was beginning to wrap it up in his argument for them to remain faithful. He said, "Therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weaknesses, your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed." Really, the entire book of Hebrews is an appeal to them to choose to think in a right way about the discouragements that they were facing. It would seem that Some of them were in some danger of ceasing to serve the Lord and just to go back to their Jewish way of life. But as is the case in every book of the Bible, where anybody was exhorted and challenged to do the best that they could do, these appeals are always, in one form or another, they're always an appeal for people to choose how they're going to think about what they're doing. We all know, at least in theory, that we have a free will, and that with regard to anything, we can decide to start thinking differently about that in a way that will help us with whatever the work is. And what a powerful thing that is that the Lord gave us when He endowed us with the ability to choose how we will think. We can't always choose our external circumstances, but we can choose how we will think about those circumstances. About a year ago, I read the book that was written by Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Nazi death camps in Germany in World War II. He was a Jewish man who had been sent, along with millions of others, to work a concentration camp where most people were put to death. But he was a medical doctor. He was a psychiatrist, but he was a medical doctor, and so probably his life was spared because he had some medical expertise that they could use in the camp. But when he describes the conditions of what that was like in those death camps, with every page of that book that I wrote, my response was the same, and that is, I don't know if I could survive in the way he did. And he makes the point over and over again that survival was a matter of choosing how you were going to respond to that terrible circumstance, or just give up mentally. The people who didn't even live long enough for the Germans to put them to death, in the gas chambers or the crematoria, they didn't make it any farther than they did because they didn't choose to think about that in a particular way. So you and I are involved in a much more important undertaking than somebody merely trying to survive the death camps of World War II. It's all the more important that we keep coming back to the passages that encourage us to choose a better way of looking at whatever discouragements the devil might throw into our path. And the key to all of it is trust in God. You can use the word faith if you want to, but faith and trust are very closely related. And to keep going and to keep working, when it comes right down to it, requires that we choose to trust God. We're not going to survive without His help, without His guidance. And on our part, we've got to choose that we will trust Him to do whatever only He can do to address the situation. And for our part, we will just continue doing what is within our power to do without knowing what the outcome is going to be, at least in the short term. So we're going to have to learn to stick to the work that is ours to do, whether individually or congregationally, and to do our best even when we can't see with our very limited future vision. We can't see how it's going to turn out well. And it may look, from the standpoint of human wisdom, like it's going to end disastrously. But the Lord challenges us to keep working, keep doing what we can do, keep doing what He has provided us the resources to do, and trust Him for the result. And I love the song that Greg has led us in this morning about the uncountable number of seed apples there are in every seed. And the seed gets planted very often by somebody who's never going to live long enough to see all of the results of that. But trusting that it's worthwhile to keep planting seeds, some of which will grow. That's the only way anybody can do anything that's worth doing in this world. And the passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 that I asked Jeff to read is toward the end of Ecclesiastes, where the writer is reaching the conclusion, which we know in the last two verses of chapter 12. The conclusion is, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So that's the ending admonition. But back at the beginning of chapter 11, in verse 1, is where he had said, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall be. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. He's using an agricultural metaphor there to illustrate how it ought to be when we're doing the work of the Lord. The point that he makes is, we very rarely can know enough of the future to know how anything is going to end up. The end of it may be long after we've passed away and we're gone from this world. But in terms of a man who has to make his living by planting things and then cultivating and then reaping the harvest, when you think about it, there's so much trust involved in what a farmer has to do that you just wonder, how anybody, if you know all the things that could go wrong in the course of a year trying to grow a crop, it's amazing anybody would have enough trust to keep doing what he does, really without any guarantee of what the outcome is going to be. In Ecclesiastes, the writer is talking about the vanity of this life. That doesn't mean that it's meaningless. My major objection to the New International Version, the NIV, is because it translates vanity in Ecclesiastes as meaninglessness. Well, this world is not meaningless, but our lives in this world are vain from the standpoint of the fact that there's so much frustration involved in seeming not to be able to do what we're trying to do, or we can't see that this is going to have any good outcome. There are just so many things that can be difficult for us in this world that it sometimes seems as if it's, there's no point in trying to do anything because of the difficulties and the challenges and the lack of any real guarantee that when we do something, that we're going to be able to reap the harvest when it comes. And so people read the book of Ecclesiastes, and sometimes they will say, well, then, if that's true, why do anything? If we can't have enough control of the situation that we can determine the outcome, then what's the point of doing anything? Well, whatever a worldly person might come up with on why you would do anything in a vain world, those who believe in God, have a different element in their thinking, don't they? I mean, we may not see any farther down the road than the secular, godless person can, but we worship a God who is the creator of this universe, and we're able to do whatever little we may be able to do in the trust that eventually God is going to do things with our little contribution to his work. He's going to do things with that are far beyond what we could have even envisioned. And it may be long after we're gone, or even if we're still living, it may be in a different place in the world than we know anything about. And so the advice of these first 4 verses in Ecclesiastes is, you go ahead and do the best that you know to do right now. And that's That's all the responsibility that any of us have, is to do the best that we can do with what limited foresight we might have, to use as much wisdom as we can, but never to just sit down and quit working because we don't think we can guarantee what the outcome is going to be. Fact of the matter is, you and I don't control very much of anything in this world. Have you noticed that? If you wanted to use a different word than the word vanity in Ecclesiastes, I don't believe it would be meaningless, as the NIV translates it. Very often, vanity in Ecclesiastes means something that is very frustrating, something that has an outcome that you would like to produce if you were in total control of the situation. But we live in a finite world where there's very little that any of us do on a day-to-day basis where you have any guarantee that you can control how it's going to turn out. I mean, if you're not willing to do anything that you can't control in this world, then you're not going to do very much. Because we are pitifully inadequate when it comes to controlling things and trying to make them be what we want them to be. But we're reminded every day that we live, in this big world, that there are things worth doing even when we don't know how it's going to turn out. One of the problems of living in the modern era, especially in the early part of the 20th century, after the Industrial Revolution had come to full bloom, and science began to discover so many things about this world, that the problem was that the more we learned about the world and the more we thought we were able now to do anything, if given enough time and government funding, there's nothing that can't be done. And so the modern age developed a mentality of control. There is no problem that we can't fix in time. Well, that's just not true. And we need to disabuse ourselves of the excessive arrogance and sense of control that the modern world wants to see us work with. Everybody knows that. I don't care what the advances of science are. Everybody knows that in the long run, we don't control very much of anything. But in the Lord's work, we don't need to be able to control the outcome, because that's in God's hands. And He can take care of it a whole lot better than we can. So our responsibility is to stick to our part of the work and to let the Lord do His part of the work. Paul used these three expressions in 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 3. He said, remembering without ceasing your work of faith and your labor of love and your patience or your endurance of hope. Well, those three qualities, that really is what's necessary if you're going to continue to do the Lord's work and do it with a mind to work. The work of faith, that's a work that's based upon trust. It's not based on thinking that we can control the world. We do that work because it's worthy to be done, and we do it as an act of faith or trust. And then the word labor, love should be the primary motivation for that. If you truly love somebody, there's no end to how hard you will work to serve that person's needs because you love them. And then the patience of hope. Patience may not be the best translation there. Patience, in essence, means the ability to endure, to be long-suffering and that kind of thing. Well, why would you ever be patient and wait for an outcome except for hope? We do a lot of things that we wouldn't do if we didn't have the hope that eventually the Lord's going to come back to this world and destroy it and take us with him to be with our Heavenly Father in eternity. And so those are the motivating factors, but they're all in one way or another based upon our trust in what the Lord will do in the future. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6, Philippians 1 and verse 6, Paul said, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. And so I think that needs to be our confidence in anything that we do that relates to the Lord's work. But in addition to trust, there's also this element of doing it as unto the Lord. That language comes from Colossians chapter 2, starting verse 23 and 24, when Paul is encouraging servants, those in that day who were physically enslaved to somebody else. If you were a Christian and you were a slave, suppose your master was not a Christian and just beat the living daylights out of you to work harder and better. What do you do if you're a slave in that situation? Do you think that being a Christian will give you the right to rebel against your master and tell him he doesn't have any right to do that to you? You're a Christian. No, Paul says, submit. Be the kind of servant that a Christian would be, which is better than any servant ever had who has an earthly master and worked for earthly rewards. So do the best that you can do. And he says in verse 23, to do that unto the Lord, as unto the Lord. That is, just imagine that the master who's going to be receiving the benefit of your service is the Lord. Wouldn't you work harder as a servant if the Lord was your master? Well, do whatever you do as unto the Lord. And so that's as much a part of our work ethic in the Lord as trust is. If we could see him face to face, ladies, how hard would you work on the meal if the Lord was personally going to come and sit at your table? You'd make that the best meal you could, right? The Lord was in the home of some of his friends that we read about him having meals in people's homes. If you acknowledge that he was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, you'd work harder for that meal than you would for anybody else, because it's him who's going to receive the benefit. So if we keep focused on our end of the work, quit trying to help the Lord run his part of the work, but just stick to our part of it, and to do that generously, diligently, gratefully, and all of those things, then we can count on the Lord to supply whatever resources we need in order for us to do what falls within our realm of responsibility. I love what Paul said to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 8, when he said, God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. Isn't that a powerful thought? That it's God who's going to have to supply the resources for us to do whatever he wants us to do in his work. And we don't ever have to worry if we're going to do something that pleases the Lord and that has the authority of the scriptures behind that, and we do that in the knowledge that this is his will and he's going to be pleased with it. You wouldn't ever worry, would you, that the Lord might not come through and provide the resources that he promised he would. That's not something we need to worry about. He's not only going to supply the resources. What does this verse say? He's going to abundantly supply the wherewithal for us to do whatever it is his will to do. just on a purely personal note, this past week in which I was with the brethren up in Greenwood, a very difficult week for me physically. I struggle with some issues that just make it very hard to do what I've done all my life with regard to publicly standing up and teaching. And several weeks ago, I was really agonizing about whether to call them at Greenwood and say, I'm just not going to be able to come. I can't do that. But my son Brock frequently beats up on me by reminding me of things that I have preached to other people in the past. And he said, Dad, you may not be able to see how in the world you could get through that week and do what they've asked you to do. But he said, it will be in the doing of it that God will supply the resources. Not previously, but it will only be as you get into the work that he'll make it possible for it to be done. Well, that's exactly what happened. I was able to get through the week last week. I don't mean at all that it was easy. I struggled, and there was one night where I just nearly passed out, in the middle of the lesson. But we got through the week. It was a good week. And some things happened that I could not have foreseen. And so Brock is exactly right, that we need not worry about whether the Lord is going to supply the wherewithal. He will supply that abundantly if we will commit ourselves to doing what he's going to make it possible for us to do. And the classic illustration of that, of course, is the people of Israel when just having left Egypt, they got to the Red Sea, and that seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle. What are we going to do now, Moses? Well, the Lord made it possible for them to get across the Red Sea onto the other side in a way that they never could have predicted. But he only did that after they got to the edge of the Red Sea and were then at the point where they needed his help to become involved. And it would have done them no good to remain in Egypt and say, well, how would we get across the Red Sea? It was only after they committed themselves to do what they could, just take one step after another, that when the time came, the Lord supplied an amazing amount of ability for them to get across the Red Sea on dry land. So anytime a congregation is having internal discussions about, are we going to do this or not in the Lord's work? We're going to do this to try to be evangelistic in our community or not? Somebody might propose an ambitious work for us to do, and there will never be any lack of naysayers, right? Who would say, well, we could never do that. We're not able to do this or that or the other. But we won't know any more than I could know before I got to Greenwood last week how I was going to get through that. But it's in the act of making the commitment to the Lord's work to do whatever we think we can do, even if it's just to take one little tiny step in the direction of that. Then little by little we begin to see that, well, yes, the Lord, this is his work, and he's going to supply whatever is needed little by little, not all at once, but little by little, in order for us to do what his work is. And so that verse has just been a powerful reminder to me. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 8. God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. And so that, I think, needs to be the mental environment that we do the Lord's work in. Trusting him, doing it as unto the Lord in the confidence that if he wants it done, then we won't have to worry about the details. He'll work all of that out. But the third thing and the final thing is something that I talked with you about the last time I was here, and that is that we must have the courage to continue. Those words are from Winston Churchill during World War II. Churchill was known for challenging people to keep going, not give up. And had it not been for his courageous leadership of the British people, particularly when they were being bombed by the German Blitz, it's doubtful that the English people might have been able to survive, what they had to survive without somebody like Winston Churchill, encouraging them to keep going, to continue. Well, a lot of what we always do in the world, we can't do if we don't have the courage to continue, just to keep going, doing what we can do. One thing we can be sure of is that the devil fights against us with, I guess in the military they call it a war of attrition, where you're not going to be able to defeat the enemy all at once, but you can wear them down over time by just constantly hammering. Well, that's the kind of warfare the devil fights against us with. It's a war in which he's going to try to wear us down little by little by little and try to get us to the point where we just give up because we're just so tired and we can't see how we can take one more step. And so then he's got us if we don't have the courage to continue. The courage of even the stubbornness, if that's what it comes to, even the stubbornness to just get indignant enough with the devil to say, I'm not going to let you do what you're trying to do to me. I'm not going to give up. And just refuse to let him have the last say. But sometimes we can be declining so slowly that we don't see it. Like Ephesus, Ephesus was at the top of the list in Revelation 2 and 3 of the letters that were sent to the 7 churches. The letters to Ephesus, the Lord expressed great praise for how faithful they had been under difficult circumstances in the past. But they were wearing down to the point where he said, you don't love me like you used to. And I want you to return to your first love, to decide that you're going to think about my work the way you used to and do better about it. We need to make the same resolve, the same commitment that we're going to, if we see that we don't love the Lord as much as we used to do whatever we have to get back to our first love. In the confidence that whatever we do in the Lord is not in vain. That's what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. When he said, you need to abound in the Lord's work, knowing that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. You can't always see the outcome, and we certainly don't control what's going to happen in the Lord's work, but we work in the confidence. We do something in the Lord, it's never going to be useless. We plant those apple seeds, trees are going to come from them, and who knows how many apples may come from that tiny seed that somebody was willing to plant. So what did Paul say in that familiar verse in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9? That we ought not to grow weary in doing good, for he said, in due season you will reap, if you don't give up. I believe the older King James said, if you faint not. And I used to not understand that as a child. We should keep doing the Lord's work and not pass out. Well, the point is, we will reap eventually if we don't give up in the meantime. So we continue to work and to sow and to water the crop and trust that the Lord will give the increase. For we work, as Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 4, as with the ability which God supplies. What a difference that makes. None of us would be able to do much of anything in the Lord's work if it was just a matter of what we could do. But we work as with the ability which God supplies, so that he will be the one who receives the glory. We do his work in his way, by his grace, and he receives the glory. And let us not say, well, I want some of that glory for myself. No, the Lord will get the glory, but our joy in eternity will be the joy of rejoicing in his triumph over his adversaries. Folks, the devil is not your adversary, except in a secondary sense. That's God's adversary. And we've been dragged into the conflict, and we will either eternally endure the punishment that the Lord metes out upon the devil and everybody who allied themselves with him, or we'll spend eternity with God enjoying his victory and his triumph over his adversaries. And we need not doubt what the outcome of the war is going to be. The thing that is yet to be determined is whether we will choose to keep fighting on God's side, knowing that in due season we will reap the reward. So, we're the Lord's people. It's right that we see ourselves as the Lord's people doing his work. That may we not hinder what the Lord wants to be taking place in this community, and where I live down in Louisville, Kentucky, by having a poor attitude about the Lord's work. Let's not present any obstacle that would hinder the Lord from doing the work that he wants to do in Columbus, Indiana, or anywhere else. Well, thank you again for inviting me to come and be with you this morning. You have refreshed my spirit, and I'm grateful to you for who you are here in this community. You get discouraged in the work here because we all get discouraged in the work wherever we are. But if I can do anything to encourage you, that's certainly what I want to do. There may be somebody here this morning who needs, in some public kind of way, to seek the assistance of the saints in this congregation, either our assistance in baptizing them into Jesus Christ, if you've learned what you need to do to receive the forgiveness of your sins, and which you just have not yet done that, then please do not go home having procrastinated that one more time. Just gather your courage together, say, yes, I put this off for far too long already. I'm ready to become one of the Lord's disciples. We'd love to assist you by baptizing you into Christ. But if you're just discouraged, maybe you become so discouraged you just don't know what step needs to be your next step, we'd love to think with you and study with you and pray with you and to help you not only know what's the next thing you need to do, but to help you do it. Be part of this family of believers who exist in part to encourage one another. If we can help you in any way, won't you let us know of that while we stand and sing the song that's been announced.